Start the recording. Good afternoon. I'm Wendy Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Tri-Faith Initiative, and I'm grateful that you're all here to join us for this important conversation today with Jeannette Gabriel. Jeanette, welcome. Thank you for being here. So today we're going to learn a little bit about a project that we hope to be a partner in, but is led by Jeannette. And we will start by having Jeannette tell us a little bit about herself, because I think sometimes that is just the best way for us to learn. And then about this project, which is one of many projects that Jeannette is part of. The reason that I thought that this was an important conversation to have is because the Tri-Faith Initiative has a race and religion task force. The task force is made up of some of our staff, as well as representatives from the partner congregations of Temple Israel, the American Muslim Institute, and Countryside Community Church. And our intention is kind of multifold. First of all, it has been under the leadership of Amanda Silva Cretchlow. I'm still learning her married name. And she is on leave because she has a broken arm. And so she'll be out for 3 months. And so yet I'd like to tell you a little bit about this task force. It was put together in response to the murder of George Floyd, and also in the kind of underpinnings of what we've learned that each of our communities is trying to do independently to respond to systemic racism, and also to learn how we might join other community partners to do education and advocacy around the topics that intersects race and religion. That conversation is so enormous that until we start to learn what it is that we are each doing as individuals, what our congregations and communities are doing, and then what the greater Omaha's community is doing, it's difficult for us to think about how to best align the resources that we have of time and talent and dollars. And so we're trying to bring this group together first as a learning cohort so that we can find out about the projects that are already happening, so that we can start to align strategically in the coming months and years to discern how to best use our voice as the Tri-Faith Initiative in collaboration. I will tell you that one of the things we are working on is a partnership with the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where we have gotten some seed money for one of their big idea projects to host a conference on the intersection of race, religion, and justice. And we're in the planning stages of putting together an advisory council for that. But our seed money is to hire an intern to plan some of the logistics. The first conference looks like it will happen in spring of 2021. Perhaps fall, 2022, perhaps fall, kind of working on planning. And a lot of that is looking to be formed around listening. How do we learn what the Empowerment Network is doing, and what we are doing, and what the Chamber is doing, and what each of our religious denominations are doing? I don't think there's good communication between sectors right now about what resources are being allocated to this conversation about religion and about race and systemic racism, but we are probably the only ones who are also asking to make the intersection with religion, and what both do our religions call us to do, but also what historically have our religions done. And so there's just an enormous opportunity for us to find some collective energy. And Jeannette's project is a gold standard, in my opinion, around ways that we might both learn about the realities of our city and the opportunity for us to increase our knowledge and also participate in a project. So I think that's the really important reason for us all to learn from and with Jeannette today. Jeannette will present for the first 30 minutes ish about her project, and then we can ask her questions, and then we can have a conversation about what it is that we hear today, what it calls or inspires us to think about doing next. And certainly I welcome all of you to share during that time things that you know about, that you think we should know about, that are happening or might happen in the community. So Jeanette, we will turn the mic over to you. And if you would start telling us a little bit about yourself and then the Spatial Justice Project, we're really excited to hear about it today.
Sure. Thank you very much. This is really a lovely opportunity to get a chance to speak with lots of folks that I recognize and some new people as well. So this is really a great opportunity. Thank you, Wendy. I will first just tell you a few little things about myself. I'm a professor in the Religious Studies Department over at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. I'm also the director of the Schwalbe Center for Israel and Jewish Studies, which was an academic research center set up 12 years ago through the generosity and vision of Nate and Hannah Schwalbe. And the center has a series of priorities, of course, a focus around Israel. Having an Israel Studies Center is, we are one of a very small number of Israel Studies centers in the world, but we also look at the focus of Jewish studies. So our other focus and priorities are on Judaism in the Midwest and connections between African American and Jewish communities. So this work really fits into a lot of my personal research priorities and that of the Schwalbe Center. And of course, I should mention one of my other research areas is addressing issues of gender. It's a topic I publish on quite a bit and have initiated a new course, permanent course over at UNO on women and religion. It's given every fall, and last fall, when it was given for the first time, we had a service learning project where the students met with Islamic and Christian women refugees in Omaha. And this fall semester, we're going to be meeting with a range of women religious leaders from throughout Omaha. Those classes are open to UNO students and community members through the Senior Passport Program. Which is for community members 65 and older, can take up to 2 classes at UNO for $25 a semester. So if anyone is interested in that, they can follow up with me. So that's just a little bit about myself. Let me tell you now some background on the strategic initiative that the University of Nebraska Omaha set up around social justice, inequality, race, and class. This has been an incredible opportunity over at UNO to develop a series of projects, of which the Race and Religion Conference that I'm working on with Tri-Faith is one of those projects that Wendy mentioned. It's very exciting. And the other is the Omaha Spatial Justice Project. And I am one of the principal investigators on that project. The other 2 principal investigators are Dr. Jennifer Harbour in the Black Studies Department and Dr. Christine Dando, who's the chair of the Geography and Geology Department. And the 3 of us together envisioned a research project that the university very graciously chose to support called the Omaha Spatial Justice Project. And before I tell you about that in some detail, I want to mention that we are part of a broader collaboration with the Service Learning Academy over at UNO, who's doing a redlining project. And so the 2 projects, the Omaha Spatial Justice Project and the redlining project through the Service Learning Academy, are working together in tandem in a variety of ways, which I would be happy to talk about in more detail. So I want to take a step back now and mention that the impetus for the Omaha Spatial Justice Project came out of my own research interests for many, many years and being able to actually document racism in the North. It's fairly easy to document racism in the South because we have a legal structure, an open legal structure of segregation. But segregation in the North functioned much more systemically and hidden. And that really, in many ways, is the definition of systemic racism, is that it's embedded within the institutions of the society and so not obviously visible into how it's manifesting itself through a variety of both public and private institutions. So how then do we show the ways that racism functioned in the North? I was inspired by a project at the University of Washington that began many years ago to be able to begin to document racism in the North by looking at property documents. Because much of the way that racism has functioned in the North is through housing and segregation of communities. I grew up in Wisconsin. Hear my accent there, maybe coming through a little bit. I grew up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, which is a small town, and I'll tell you it was very challenging to grow up Jewish there. And I witnessed quite a bit growing up in one of the most segregated cities of the country, which was Milwaukee. And Milwaukee had sort of absolutely invisible lines between white and black that was all based around housing. And so this really sort of colored my thoughts about what racism in the North looked like. Also, the town that I grew up in, Fond du Lac, is a sundown town, was a sundown town. For those of you who have never heard that term, sundown town is a term that meant that Black people really needed to be out by the time the sun went down. And in some communities, this manifested openly, and in other communities, it manifested just sort of through a community understanding. So based on those really formative experiences and my own interest in intersections between African American and Jewish communities, I have been searching for ways to really document through research what segregation in the North looks like. And so about 10 years ago, a program began through the archives at the University of Minnesota called Mapping Prejudice. And that project tried to look at all the property deeds in Hennepin County and document the racially restrictive covenants that are found within property documents. Now, there are many different types of property covenants. There can be property covenants over what color houses can be painted, or a whole variety of restrictions, how yards can be used. But racially restrictive covenants, we see primarily beginning with the professionalization of the real estate industry around the 19-teens. And these racially restrictive covenants became a policy nationally of the Real Estate Association and were included in property deeds. So they were embedded into the deed documents. And we see a wide variety of what these covenants look like. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But there is no one racially restrictive covenant. But there is certainly a template that the Real Estate Association developed nationally and particularly throughout the North. So over the last 10 years, Mapping Prejudice has been working to document all of the racially restrictive covenants in Minneapolis, in Hennepin County, and is now spread out in that project and is beginning to look at the racially restrictive covenants in Milwaukee. So my research team, myself, Dr. Harper, were really inspired by Mapping Prejudice and thought that it would be very useful to be able to develop a similar project here in Douglas County. And we're looking at the period of time from about 1910 through 1965. The Supreme Court ruled against racially restrictive covenants as early as 1948, but their ruling was quite limited. It just ruled that courts could not uphold racially restrictive covenants, which means that they continued to be widely practiced and being put into deeds. And in fact, the vast majority of racially restrictive covenants that we see imposed are in the post-war period, when there's a housing boom and we begin to see the development of a middle class as sort of a national phenomena. The reason that we're sort of capping this project at 1965 is because of the passage of the Fair Housing Act that really led to the decline, significant decline, of racially restrictive covenants. Now, that does not mean that there's not a variety of institutional practices that have continued, even up to the present day, to restrict various groups from living in certain areas. And I would suggest to this group today that the way that that continues to manifest itself in the present is through a variety of public policies that restrict groups from moving out of particular neighborhoods, transportation opportunities, and in addition, neighborhood association bylaws. And one of the things that we are very interested in is bringing together a variety of sources. So the main project of the Omaha Spatial Justice Project is to create a database which will be housed at UNO and be available to researchers both inside the university and in the community. And we expect to find comprehensively throughout Douglas County between 30 and 45,000 racially restrictive covenants that are tied to property documents. It took about 10 years to do this project up in Minnesota. We expect it will not take that long here because we have a big jump start, which is all the property deeds are already digitized here in Douglas County. So we are working with the Douglas County Deeds Office in collaboration with them to be able to get all the property documents and then sift through millions and millions and millions of pages of documents and identify the racially restrictive covenants. Now, this kind of gets to the exciting part, right? Once we've been able to get our hands on those racially restrictive covenants, and I say get our hands on because I can't tell you how many times I have heard people in Omaha say, in the few years that I've lived here, that they know there was a racially restrictive covenant on a property that they had or that their parents had. But for people to actually be able to see those documents, to have those documents, is much more challenging because those aren't the kind of documents that people usually keep. So what we are trying to do is go beyond the existing data, and the existing data is something that's found in the Homeowner Loan Corporation maps. So during the Great Depression, the federal government wanted to try to deal with the foreclosure crisis and provide an opportunity for a large section of the population to be able to buy homes with the understanding that this would be a path to the accumulation of generational wealth. Because the main way that people in America have developed wealth that they can pass down from generation to generation is through building equity in their homes, selling homes, acquiring that equity, and advancing their standard of living. So if you do not have access to home ownership or homes with increasing value, then you have been cut out of that path to intergenerational wealth. And this is really a major point of institutional racism that is hidden. So the government set up the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s to provide access to low-income loans so that people would be able to jumpstart this process of developing generational wealth through housing. The Homeowner Loan Corporation adopted the practices of the private mortgage companies in identifying areas of high, medium, and low risk and providing loans on the basis of those risk categories. So if you wanted to purchase a home and you came out of a low risk area and were seeking to get a home in a low risk area, then you could get a substantial loan. But if you were coming out of a high risk area or wanted to purchase a home in a high risk area, your options were much more limited. And this was through the justification that the mortgage companies and now the government through their policy of the HOLC burdened a higher risk factor in investing in you. So how did they identify what were low risk and high risk neighborhoods? They identified them based around a variety of factors, including income, race, ethnicity, and crime. And all those things created a perfect storm to identify historically non-white communities as high risk, which meant that non-white communities did not have the same access to the home loans coming out of the 1930s and into the post-war period. Why am I telling you all this background, which maybe is not that exciting? It's because this is actually the only clear documentation we have of something called redlining, which is what the mortgage companies and then the government did in identifying high-risk areas by putting red lines around them on maps. So our project with the Omaha Spatial Justice Project is to provide a significant body of data beyond what redlining maps show us to be able to document institutional racism right here in Douglas County. One of the main ways we're going to do this, because this is such a huge task, to look through these tens of thousands of documents that are potentially racially restrictive covenants, is to engage the community directly through a research methodology called crowdsourcing. And what we are going to do with crowdsourcing is engage groups of volunteers from the community to work with us in looking through these covenants and identifying language that may be a racially restrictive covenant. Now I say may because it's not obvious. Language that's used is used to obscure the fact that developers and homeowners and neighborhood associations are engaging in racist behavior. So the language that's used can be very vague. It might say this property can only be owned by Caucasians or inhabited by Caucasians, but keep in mind that's tricky because the definition of Caucasian changes between 1910 and 1965. The definition of Caucasian is fluid. Groups that were not seen as Caucasian, like Jews and Italians and Bohemians, become Caucasian in the post-war period. So that is a tricky term. In addition, sometimes the racially restrictive covenants will say things like, you can only be a member of this neighborhood association. Well, then that means that to show that this is actually a racially restrictive covenant, to prove it, we would need to track down the bylaws of that neighborhood association. So we need accompanying documentation. We need those powerful oral history stories that people have of how their families were being discriminated against. because all of that will help us understand the language that we see in the covenants. So this is an enormous and tremendously exciting project that we anticipate will take a period of years to finalize. Let me just say that our goal, once we have finalized the database of racially restrictive covenants, is to set up an Omaha Spatial Justice research group, research center, research group at UNO of scholars that are using this material and developing new research in many, many, many different areas of interdisciplinary scholarship. So not just are we telling a story of history, not just are we going to create a whole series of maps to visualize the data, but this information can be used by public policy scholars, by environmental studies scholars who are interested in the impact of lead in restricting certain groups from being able to move out of communities. And air quality, of course. This can be used by education scholars who are looking at how educational opportunities were restricted based on geography. There are endless opportunities to think about how these covenants can be used and the new complexity that can be brought to the discussion of what institutional racism looks like in Douglas County. There are also next further steps of possible research projects, because once we cannot look at Douglas County in a bubble. Douglas County is connected to other counties where we expect to see a significant number of racially restrictive covenants. As Omaha begins to move west into Sarpy County, then we begin to see that development and growth south and west is largely white. What sorts of racially restrictive covenants might we find within those communities? When we look at the data that's emerged out of Minneapolis, we see that racially restrictive covenants basically form rings, and this is why it's so important to have maps to visualize it, form rings around historically non-white communities, literally blocking people in so that there is nowhere to go. We hope that the step of bringing in the community to look over the deeds will be an important process for the community in witnessing, identifying and witnessing these actual acts of racism that took place that have previously been hidden from us. It will be a powerful moment of witnessing and giving strength and legitimacy to people's oral histories, and also a very, very important moment for groups that in some ways benefited from the racially restrictive covenants to come to terms with the history of our community. The Race and Religion Task Force provided a really important place for me to begin to think about how these racially restrictive covenants could be used for many different community projects. For example, there has been interest among the Race and Religion Task Force around the topic of reparations. And we have seen now in Evanston, Illinois, for the first time, a community has passed community legislation around reparations bill around housing to provide reparations to people in Evanston who were historically impacted by policies like racially restrictive covenants. If we don't have this data, there's no way for people to make claims. Because the truth of the matter is, and this is a hard truth, but one of the ways that institutional racism functions is that it delegitimates non-white voices. So if people say that they've had experiences with institutional oppression, those experiences are not always lended the credence that they deserve, which is why the documentation becomes so much more important. So I guess I've spoken for quite a while there, and I want to give time for questions. I'm sure that I can flush out some of the details more and some of the questions that you have. And so I really appreciate all of you coming to hear this little overview, and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and ideas of the directions that the research should go.
Thank you. This isn't the first time that I've heard you share, but it's certainly your message is deepening each time that you share, and also raises so many questions for me. But I certainly, this is a conversation. I know many of you have different seats in this conversation, and so please unmute yourself or raise your hand or put a question in the chat as they come up for you. My first question that I have for you, Jeanette, is I have so many. Which one to start with? I think that the intersection of race and religion, I think, is important because this is a tri-faith conversation. As you are looking at these documents and thinking about it, is there an opportunity perhaps to overlay on the map the development of religious communities in Douglas County to see whether or not the establishment of faith communities is highlighted in any way? You know, they say you belong to a faith community, often location, 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 right? So I'm curious to see how that map might look.
That's a really excellent point, Wendy, and I think it also speaks to the movement of congregations. You know, the question is always, do congregations move because communities move, or do communities move because congregations move? There's a dynamic, a tension between the two. And so as we see congregations within many different groups in Omaha moving west and moving south into areas that are less diverse, it's interesting to think about how the areas that people are moving into might be covenanted and what that means for those congregations and what it means for the interactions those congregations have with more diverse communities. Because tri-faith, of course, the fundamental basis of tri-faith is that in order for groups of different backgrounds to understand each other and get along, they must be near each other. They must spend time with each other. And so it's really a central point to what we're looking at with the racially restrictive covenants. When people are no longer living in proximity to each other, when they're no longer neighbors, when they no longer have those sort of personal relationships of interdependence, it's much easier to believe larger social stereotypes and put people into categories where you can minimize, demonize, and dismiss them, and accept larger social policies that hinder their development and growth. So this is a really critical piece, one that we are very interested in mapping. And of course, just from the perspective of the Jewish community, which the Jewish community was largely considered non-white in 1910 and based largely in North Omaha with the African American community, and then began a transition west 4 times. There's been 4 movements, well, 3 movements west, 4 different states of congregations. That in itself will be really fascinating to look at, especially when you have a group that own status is racial status within the society is shifting. And I would say that's not unique to the Jewish community in Omaha. We see that within many of the Eastern European groups in Omaha that in 1910 are largely not considered white, but by 1965 have been integrated into whiteness.
Fascinating. Um, Sherry, I'm curious, is your question related to this faith piece, or should we go to Beth's question first? I just want to make sure we ask in the right order.
It's interesting because my question came up and then Jeanette just started talking about exactly what I wanted to ask. So I think it's just the right time. So
keep going.
I left Omaha when I was 9, and we lived in good proximity to the old Temple Israel. And that neighborhood, was known as the Bagel. We had Jewish folks all over the place. And so my question is kind of more, I don't know who it's really answering, but when the temple moved west, did the Jews move west with that? Because I mean, like so many of my family, I mean, I remember Wendy lived in what we called West Omaha, which was, off 90th at that time. But I'm just wondering if the Jewish community, if you saw the population moving away from that area where the old building was out towards the new building.
I can speak to that in some sense, and then Jeanette can fill in as well. At the point that Temple Israel was considering a move, we did a zip code study, and the Dodge Street corridor did not exist yet at the point that the zip code study was done. The zip code study showed that the majority of the Jewish population had already moved west. Now, I think that if we were being authentic about this conversation, the Dodge Street corridor changed the conversation, but it changed the conversation post the congregation having already made the decision to move a bit west. And the Tri-Faith became initiative, co-location piece became part of the decision-making factor of the move, because the actual transportation time of 72nd Street to 144th, we were told not to move any further than 168th Street in our discernment. And also the one of the reasons that we looked for land in co-location was the synagogue was that leaders were or particularly the past leaders were proposing that the land acquisition for a fourth location for the congregation needed to be between Dodge Street and Center Street, between 120th and 168th. It wasn't like we were given a great big area to look, and we were looking for a parcel of 10 or 14 acres, and there weren't very many acres in that size parcel. And there is an intersection with this conversation about the discernment about moving away from the diversity within Omaha and acknowledging the whiteness of West Omaha in that move. And so kind of the proximity of faith partners and diversity of faith partners co-locating softened some of the conversation and intention around priorities of the conversation during that. In terms of covenants or policy or legal documents, Jeanette, I'm not a thought leader in this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think that's really fascinating to know. That's really wonderful. And I think both what Wendy said and what Cookie has put in the chat, this is why it's so important to sort of have these community voices be part of the discussion. That, researchers at UNO can't do this in a vacuum. We need to do this with the community. And I really appreciate what Wendy said about each time she hears my narrative, it gets richer. And that's because there have been ongoing discussions, certainly with the African American community, about sort of what this project means. And I want to say a couple of things to your point, Sherry, which is really interesting. Is, I was giving a talk at a Rotary chapter, and I got a little bit of a negative reaction from one member who was concerned about the blame that will be assigned to people who chose to move west, or people whose families had racially restrictive covenants. And this is really not about blame. This is about how institutional racism functions, because people move to get better access to infrastructure, to get better access to educational systems, to get better access to transportation systems, to get a cleaner, sort of more vibrant community environmentally. And we're not judging, making negative judgments about these decisions, right? We are focusing on how these institutional factors operate to bring these various factors together so that some groups are able to take advantage of those benefits and other groups are not. And so I think that's a really important point. Now, I will say that there's been a lot of discussion about the sort of movement within Jewish communities nationally. And there's a really interesting book that I'd be happy to send out to people that I used for a class that I gave on African American and Jewish relations about a Jewish community in Philadelphia that chose not to be part of the Western migration out to West Philadelphia and intentionally chose to stay embedded in an African American community. So, many decisions have been made in different ways at different times by different communities. But it's hard for a community to buck the institutional benefits of movement. And I would really caution us to sort of not look upon that with judgment, but, more with understanding that this is what a system of racism means and how people are caught up in it.
And I would like to just also highlight that we, Jeanette and I are both Jewish, and we are heavily talking in this particular conversation about the movement of the Jewish community in Omaha. The Muslim community in Omaha has grown significantly, but more recently. And then in terms of the Christian community, particularly the Catholic community in Omaha, I think it would be very interesting and important for us to acknowledge they too have had these kinds of shifts west and siloed, that the racial silos of Omaha exist also. I've said this many times publicly and read it lots of places. Sunday morning is the most siloed hour of the week. So that is very true in terms of where people affiliate with their congregations across the religious spectrum.
Can I add something to that, Wendy, about ethnicity?
Sure.
Because we are really fascinated to see what we're going to find when we look into the complexities of ethnicity. There was a Native American community downtown that was affected by racially restrictive covenants. And of course, you have all these sort of complexities of definition around ethnicity. We're very interested to see what we find within the covenants. I want to mention that in Milwaukee, they have found the racially restrictive covenants that identify restricting aliens. And that is a language that was used from the 19-teens through the late 40s to identify non-citizens. So it's interesting to think about how these restrictions move beyond race into much more sort of complex categories, and how that then operates here in Omaha. We're really interested to be able to see the different ways that race and ethnicity are going to be identified within these covenants themselves, and think about how that impacts people's self-identifications and how they relate to others in terms of opportunities for advancement.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit more about how your collective is looking at some definitions? So whiteness is one that you called out. Reparations is another one that is a complex word for us to throw around without a shared definition for. I'm concerned that people have pushback to the word reparations without having a shared definition, similar to I feel about how conversations around defunding the police are often misinterpreted because we don't have a shared definition of what we're talking about.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say that our role as researchers at UNO is to create this database and then have it be used and interpreted by scholars and community members in a variety of ways. So that our goal is really to provide more data that can then be analyzed and hopefully policymakers and community organizations can use it for their own purposes. But our goal is not to direct or initiate those outside projects. So in terms of reparations around housing, this has been interpreted in Evanston in a particular way. There's no, in a sense, one definition, but I would suggest that reparations is sort of very deeply tied to religious justice, the notion of making people whole for past grievances, but what that actually means in terms of policy interpretations is going to be broad and diverse. So in Evanston, this has been interpreted as people who can prove that they were restricted from housing in Evanston, and I'm not sure what rubric is being used to be able to show that evidence, can receive a housing stipend, to be able to support the purchase of a home in that community. So that's how reparations has been interpreted in that context. Now there is opposition from people who think that stipend is inappropriate, and from groups that think that reparations should be given in cash and not stipends towards housing purchase. So no one reparations program is going to be above reproach, but it seems that there are a variety of ways of looking at what this type of making people whole and addressing a past act of injustice and trying to create justice for the future might mean.
Thank you. I have not missed the question about volunteering and the crowdsourcing. I just think it's maybe appropriate now for us to come back to that. What kind of ask do you see coming related to that? What kind of preparation? What kind of numbers are you needing? How might people who are interested get in touch with you? That's my standard. I like to ask 3 or 4 questions at one time.
Sure, no problem. I love it, Wendy.
It's a tri-faith thing.
Exactly. Stick to 3, right?
Three questions one time.
Let me say we are not there yet, but over the next 6 months, we are going to begin putting together a database of people who are interested in volunteering. And early next year, we'll begin to do trainings. And really, this is largely dependent on how quickly we can get the data, because as quickly as we can get the data, we want to begin this process, right? So we are going to try to identify some pilot data and begin to work quickly on that. But our timeline is you can begin to contact. We're going to have a staff person on the project over the next month and a half. Before then, you can just drop me an email at the Schwalbe Center and say that you are interested. And we will begin the process of developing a database of potential volunteers and doing community trainings.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for your resource. I'll make sure that I put a link to that in the follow-up email. And the book that Jeanette had mentioned also. Jeanette, if you could share that with me after. Sure. So that we can give everyone more resources.
I want to mention that the Omaha Council Bluffs article is based on the HOLC maps. Yeah. And so that's been what the research so far has been based on. And it's been useful. The existing research has been useful because if you put the HOLC maps next to a racial map of Omaha today, we see very little change, unfortunately. but it's not useful in document people couldn't move and where they couldn't move, and sort of how these intersection of different forces operated. And I really appreciate that comment about the intersection of the educational policy, because that shows sort of the level of institutional complexity that takes place, right? And then when the school district tries to address that inequity through a variety of busing strategies, does that or does that not fundamentally change the policies related to funding and housing, right?
Right. Well, that kind of leads into the intersection of Cookie and Ellen's questions, which are, how many people do you think know? And as you start to open the wound, what pushback do you expect, or politicization of this work? Sabotage was Ellen's words.
Well, let me say we are scholars. We are not serving a particular ideological agenda. We are trying to create a database of documents that will be useful. So one of the main ways that we really hope to be able to address critiques as they emerge is by developing deep community engagement throughout this project, so that people feel invested personally and invested through their communities in its accomplishment and success.
Abdul.
I have a question.
Okay, you can be next, Cookie.
Okay.
Go ahead, Abdul.
Oh, am I next?
Thank you.
We'll let Abdul go, and then you.
Okay,
Cookie.
perfect.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. What can we do at, AMI to, start the conversation, with our congregation in, preparing them, as, prospective volunteers, in this endeavor, or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Question.
how can we help in this?
That's such a great question. I think that the Race and Religion Task Force is a good place for AMI to engage, because we're sort of beginning that work, and you can hear from other congregations in that setting about sort of projects that they've developed within their religious communities to begin to address these issues, so that you're not reinventing the wheel, right? I'm myself and Dr. Harbour and Dr. Dando are happy to come out and give presentations at congregations that and religious communities that are interested, as we lead into the training process.
And also, Abdul, to acknowledge that the conversation around race within the Muslim community is nuanced in ways that is very different than in the Jewish or Christian populations in particular. And some of the realities of relationship between the immigrant population in the Muslim population and the Black community in general, of just the ethnic differences are very important conversations for us to have together and to learn from. Chicago, again, is an incredible model and resource for us to learn from and with, and bringing perhaps some resources that are very specific to the lens of the Muslim community related to race, I think would be very empowering for the AMI community.
I would agree with Wendy and add to that I'm so excited to have this conversation with AMI, because I think the community is in many ways more diverse than many of the other religious partners here in Omaha. So it really is, it has tremendous potential for wonderful conversations and engagement.
I would agree. Cookie.
Well, we are ready. And,
thank you, Abdul. Cookie, we just have a couple minutes left. I want to try to get to everyone's questions.
I just wanted to say bravo to what you're doing, Jeanette, but I would also remind everyone that when there was busing, it was statistical busing. It had nothing to do with integrating the children. It had to do with raising the third grade all went to Saratoga School as the third grade. They didn't integrate with the kids. And that's because my kids were bused. The other thing, I asked my question and I don't know if you answered it, but in general, the general public, are they aware of both what you're talking about in racial covenants and or in the mortgage loan situation that affected the housing and the restrictions?
I don't think there's a widespread public awareness of these topics, which is why we're so excited to have the partnership with the Service Learning Academy around redlining, because they're engaging in community partnerships and developing classes that are that they're taking students out into the community to sort of raise awareness around these issues. I think that redlining has sort of become a broad term to mean racism within housing, and we're hoping to bring greater complexity and understanding to how both private and public institutions interacted to make this all possible.
Thank you. Carol, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe deepen your concern about your question about keeping it?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that in doing this, I know it's supposed to be tri-faith, and I know other religious groups, I don't know why I can't get the video, but
There you go.
there we go, would be involved in it, but I don't want to create, I mean, it's going to be very obvious that this came from the Jewish community, and I don't want to create one more thing or excuse for anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish extremism and I wondered if you thought of that through and what you will do to keep that from happening.
So I appreciate that question, Carol. I want to clarify that the idea did not come from the Jewish community. The idea came from UNO in a collaboration between myself at the Schwalbe Center, my colleague, Dr. Dando, who's in geography, and Dr. Jennifer Harbour, who's in Black Studies. So this is very much a partnership across, 3 disciplines, religious studies, Black studies, and geography. And I think you raise an important point to consider because the Jewish community both suffered from racially restricted covenants and benefited from racially restrictive covenants. But I think there are other communities here in Omaha that went through that same dynamic. And so this isn't something that's just going to center on the Jewish community. It's going to be a very, very broad look because there were many, as I mentioned, there were many groups between 1910 and 1965 in Omaha that underwent this transition to whiteness.
Of course, I understand that. I just want at every opportunity for you to mention that collaboration, please.
Right. Jim.
Unmute. I was wondering, Jeanette, are you looking at all at public policy regarding how this happened? I'm thinking as you talked, specifically looking at the location of Interstate 480, where it was
Sure. Yeah, it's a big part of it, right? The bifurcation of the community. Right. And of course, this was not just a bifurcation that took place in Omaha, but all the major cities throughout the north saw a development of a major highway construction through traditionally non-white communities. So it's part of sort of national planning processes. Yes.
I was also thinking as I was driving down there toward the intersection of Interstate 80 and 480 about how they also managed to pave over some of the more infamous former white ethnic areas.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
As well. And then they had the opportunity to reopen 18th Street.
And chose not to.
Demolition of the auditorium, and they chose not to. And
yeah, this is all important pieces of the project, right? I want to clarify that our first step is really just to create this database of racially restrictive covenants, but obviously this is a much more complex picture. And as we were garnering interest and support from different scholars at UNO in developing this project, we received tremendous interest from public policy. from the School of Public Policy, and we anticipate that they will be heavily involved in using these documents.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Jeanette, thank you as always for your professionalism and your willingness to share so openly. And for all of you for showing up. We have a lot of work to do. And so collectively, we are stronger. So I know that we are also in the midst of extraordinarily uncertain times again. And so I would call on each of you to think about this afternoon to check in with 3 people who might just need to know that they are loved. So the work is hard and we're going to get through it together. But also the increase in the Delta and kind of this fear of what's unknown ahead of us. We really need each other. So please do take a minute today to check on a couple people.
Thank you,
Thank you all
Wendy.
for showing up. See you all
Appreciate the
soon.
conversation very much.
Take care.